Joseph, welcome. Thanks for sitting down with me in this space, joining us for this conversation series. I want to launch right in, and we're doing this conversation where we're exploring rage, grief, and goodness. When you hear about these three topics, what rises up for you? And where does your heart go when you think about these three things?
Just so your congregation knows, I'm a Presbyterian pastor. I'm connected at First Presbyterian Church at College in Mulberry, but my full-time job is with the Presbyterian Foundation. I serve about 900 churches as kind of a consultant and a resource person in Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. So a very diverse stretch of the country from, Steamboat all the way to New Orleans. So I get to serve and listen to church people really across the country in my work every day. In that work, kind of as a pastor, there is a profound sense of loss and just sort of institutionally in the Presbyterian Church. We sort of hold up this 5-minute period in 1950 when church life was perfect for a really small portion of the population in our country. And I'm not sure that in the 70 years since that mythical 5-minute period in the United States, when white Protestant males had a moment of, we got it, I'm not sure we've ever really dealt with the grief that is just ongoing and perpetual, and we swim in it in the particular world that I have been called to serve. And so there's a lot of sadness, just sort of institutionally. And then you add on top of that, the grief that comes from, we can't meet together. At least we can't meet together like we used to, and the sorrow that comes from that. And then add on that, some of the things going on in our society in terms of racial reconciliation and an awareness of white supremacy that both inspire lots of grief, because we've got to own our piece of that. And that's really, really hard on its own, but then also rage, right, at injustice. And then how do we do all that when we can't actually meet in person? And what does it look like to process these things and protest? And then, kind of the core of our story about goodness, right? Like, that there is this sense of goodness within people, even people with whom we disagree, but also acknowledging that systems aren't inherently good. Right. And maybe that's sort of the original sin. So, yeah, it's messy and complicated. And then when I bring it into Fort Collins with my role in the Interfaith Council, it's both heartening to hear that it's not just Presbyterian Christians that are experiencing a lot of those things. But in some ways, one of the things I think that unites faith communities across our city is this sense of shared grief and rage, but also I hope an awareness of goodness. In those three words, we really hear sort of life at its best and worst and messiest. It also struck me that those are words that go hand in hand, I think, with any religious practice. We don't use the term religion, at least in the kind of religious slice of Christianity that I live in. We don't tend to use that word very positively. And I'm on this quest to kind of reclaim that word. But part of kind of any religious or spiritual practice, I think, open space where we can explore grief and rage and goodness, and not just explore those feelings, but own them and live into them.
I've been reading, I don't know if you've gotten a chance to check out Love and Rage. It's Lama Rod Owens' book. He talks about that rage and anger are the soul's crying out for an untended wound. It's a self-protection when the wound isn't being tended to. I wonder, what is the wound that you would say is the injury or the hurt that you would say we're protecting?
So speaking for myself, I think that I used the word paralyzing earlier in relation to the pandemic. There's something paralyzing about being a privileged person in a position, even marginally, to help affect change, right? I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. I don't know I want to be an ally. In my more sort of hubris filled moments, I have prided myself in being an ally in various stages of my life and career. I think that maybe the pain point is owning my own personal, but also just sort of societal complicity in why things are the way they are. And that's a hard one, right? Like owning my sense of I'm part of the problem. I want desperately to be part of the solution. There's an awareness of just owning the fact that I can't help that I am part of the problem simply by the place in society I was born into. There's pain, I think, that goes along with that. And I don't mean that in a like, oh, you should feel bad for me or white mainline liberal Protestants, right? So that's a different kind of pain than other groups in our country have experienced, right? Their pain is more direct as a result, maybe, of our complacency. And I also think there's something to admitting we have injured ourselves. We have sort of participated in self-injury of our souls, of our communal souls, and we need to own that so that we can then kind of move forward. There's a great magazine for not just for preachers, but I don't know if you've ever heard of The Sun, but there was a writer once I read, he said, grief is the amniotic fluid of humanity. And I like that because it is hopeful that, something new life comes out of amniotic fluid, but we've got to sort of swim through the grief and also own the rage and acknowledge where's that come from.
What you're getting at, what comes to mind is the power of confession, which is not something we talk about too much in liberal traditions. But I think what you're getting to is, the acknowledgement of complicity, the acknowledgement of intentional and unintentional harm that we have caused. And I don't know, I wonder if does confession live in your life? Does it live in your practices or in your ministry in any way?
I grew up in a very different tradition than the one I currently reside in. And so, it took a number of years, a great therapist to redeem the language around confession. I grew up in a tradition where confession was shame-filled, oftentimes kind of designed to sort of say something publicly, to be shamed publicly, really as a way of control. There was, I think, power components in that. Ideally, I think confession at its best is not about power or shame, but it's about ownership and it's about freedom. Not freedom from the consequences. I mean, confession isn't about, oh, if I just say I'm sorry, I don't have to deal with the consequences. I mean, that's a cheap understanding of confession. When really, I think it's a practice that can open us up to ourselves, to one another, and then to the universe, whatever language we want to use around that, in deeper ways. Yeah.
I was just reading about, different practices for dealing with folks that are either anti-vax or anti-precaution. And the point in the article was, shame never changed anyone. And I think it's a really, it's something that I think as ministers, we wrestle with a lot, how to inspire or evoke human change and individually and systemically, and the use of shame in religious tradition, we both know is, has caused all kinds of harm. And though it might have short-term gains in some people's eyes, the sense of, where does liberation and abundant life come from? And starting from a path of shame doesn't tend to get you there.
So the thing about shame, though, is it's such a easy, sometimes almost fun stick to wield, right? Like there is sort of low investment, good feeling when I swing the shame stick. My son is a freshman at Pooter, and he rides his bike to school, and there's a group of parents and some people standing outside the school protesting masks. And my son thinks it's ridiculous. He doesn't understand it. And listening to him, there is this sense of of rage almost, that like, why are these people doing this? I don't understand it. And he's begun to talk about wanting to talk to them, which I think is fine. But he comes up with these sort of wonderful 14-year-old quips that are totally driven, like they are shame-based quips that he thinks these zingers are going to turn those protesters into allies. And so we've had a lot of dinner table conversations the last few weeks around what does interaction in that particular circumstance look like? What would fruitful interaction look like? What are your motivations for interacting? Like, if I'm honest, they're wonderful zingers. But then if I kind of step back from my own stuff, it's just not a fruitful way to move forward. And so I get sort of the shame impulse, and it's terrible.
I was thinking about our conversation and I don't know, the bigger cultural, the global forces swirling around, and in particular that we're headed towards the anniversary of the September 11th attacks. So as we head into this particular anniversary, do let's just start with this question of confession. And what is that a fruitful way to think about how to move through this moment? Or is what do you see as forces of moving towards goodness in the midst of these forces that feel so collectively like continued wounds?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, that is the question, right? How do we move forward in a way that honors the very best in our traditions? I mean, when I think about 9/11 in this particular moment, where 20 years later, I know Afghanistan is different than it was in 2001, but in many ways, it is the same as it was in 2001. The same people who were in power when we went in to take over are now in power in just about the whole country. It's a terrible place for women. Heaven, can't, like LGBT folks there, it's like hell. So 20 years later, thousands of lives, trillions of dollars. There's a part of me that wonders, how can we not, as American people, not confess our hubris, our pride, our sense of moral superiority, our sense of waste? And I use that language carefully but intentionally. I don't ever want to downplay the sacrifices that people have made, but this might be a moment where, if as a country we can't confess our brokenness, our lack of exceptionalism, then I think we're doomed. It's also one of these moments that it is important that we know what's going on around the world. Like, I need to know about the heartbreak people are experiencing sitting outside of the airport in Kabul. Like, I have to weep, and I need to be able to read those stories. I also run the risk of almost being addicted to the terror on the other side of the planet. And then the risk is I don't see what's going on around me in my own neighborhood in North Fort Collins, or what's happening in Colorado. And so there's an aspect of all this for me as we sort of have this stew of 9/11, 20 years later, the horror in Afghanistan, the Day of Atonement coming up for our Jewish brothers and sisters. I mean, all of that sort of seems like the perfect stew for us to admit we need one another. We are a broken people, and we have no choice but to continue to move forward. Which I think at the end of the day, that's what confession and assurance of grace, no matter what tradition you're a part of, I think that's what it compels us to do. I think as individuals, which at the end of the day is all we can do. And so I guess what I would say to the people I serve, the thing I would hope for my neighbors, is that while, yes, we need to maintain this awareness of what's going on well beyond the borders of Fort Collins, I do think at the end of the day, really the only real change I get to affect is. And so I need to put my efforts here. Like, what does racial reconciliation look like here? What does police justice or injustice look like here? Those are things that I can that I can do something about. As heartbreaking as those scenes in Kabul are, I can't do anything about that, at least not in the same tangible way. And so my confession has got to lead me to some sort of tangible change. Otherwise, I'm not sure it's true confession, for lack of a better word. And I don't mean that judgmentally, but I think confession that doesn't sort of spur us somewhere. I would say the same thing about rage, that doesn't move us in a direction. I would question where that comes from.
I really want to go back to, we're talking about engaging and staying with the heartbreak. And I'm reading another book that we're kind of engaging through this series. Is called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. But in there, she talks about that, well, she talks about that you need to make an apprenticeship of sorrow, that it becomes a teacher that you live with your whole life. But in order to do that, you have to learn a kind of, you have to engage a steady practice that fortifies you to be able to allow grief and sorrow in as a companion.
Hmm.
And so I wonder, as you're recommending, or imagining a world where we are engaging the heartbreak in a pretty robust way, what are the practices that you think fortify to make that even possible?
I do a little whitewater rafting, and I took a swiftwater rescue course once, and they had us. This is in the Arkansas River at the end of spring, so tons of water coming through, and the whole course took place not in boats in the river. And one of the first exercises we had to do was walk out as far as we could into this raging whitewater by ourselves. And there's a technique for doing that. And then we slowly added people. And by the time we had about 6 rescuers moving out into the water, it was amazing how stable and how easily we could move into this terrifying and powerful current. And in some ways, in my mind, that is religion at its very best. So, I engage in a practice of owning my brokenness. I engage in a practice of corporate confession. I engage in a practice of sort of communal discernment about where God, the universe, the spirit might be leading us. I can do that in a way when I'm with people that I simply can't sustain on my own. There's something that happens in communities of faith, in religious, sort of bound in the best way possible communities, where we can't allow ourselves to forget, right? Like there is maybe the great sin of well, in my own life is my prompt ability to forget the harm I've done. Now there's a difference. Like we, never forget 9/11. Okay, great. We can get hung up in that maybe misplaced rage and think it's all about justice and striking it to our enemies, or we can remember the brokenness, the lost lives, the pain of that day. We can also remember what was our part as a country in the events that led up to that. And I am not, in no way am I rationalizing what the people who destroyed the Twin Towers did, but there's an aspect of, in communities, it is harder, it can be harder to forget. And I think some of this work involves, we can't forget. This sort of ability to engage in sorrow requires, I think, a slowing down, a groundedness that happens in communities of faith in a way that it simply does not happen in society at large, because society at large wants us to buy more, do more, connect more, I would argue, in an effort to forget or to ignore. And so I think one of the great gifts that communities of faith have is this ability to hold space where we can engage in this difficult work that I would argue can only really happen with other human people.
What came to mind as you were talking, Joseph? Elie Wiesel's notion of God, and the the idea of God is just the act of remembering, and just how I think it's such a powerful idea right now in what I experience as cultural amnesia in a lot of ways, and historical amnesia. And what I know about amnesia and that notion of forgetting, it is a trauma response. And so and so then, as we in religious institutions, or as people of faith, respond to that impulse, we can remember that it's as Resmo Menakem talks about, that you're not defective, you're protective.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that we are not failures in forgetting. We protected ourselves really well
Yeah.
so that we could survive.
Yeah.
And so then, as we peel the onion of this pain, we are we have to be tender with ourselves and with each other, because that that act of forgetting and then trying to remember was protective.
Yeah. And how do we create room for remembering that doesn't turn into self-flagellation, right? Like I'm not at all advocating for places where we are constantly reminded of all the terrible things we did or did. And we need spaces where we can explore that stuff, and exploring it with an aim toward not forgetting, but what does redemption look like? What does reconciliation look like? And I think we have opportunity to do a better job at how do we create room to acknowledge, to refuse to forget, but always with an eye toward grace. One of my favorite, one of the very few things I remember from my time in seminary was a quote by Karl Barth, who wrote like thousands of pages in this famous work called The Church Dogmatics, of which I did not read, but there's a dogmatics and outline that he wrote, which is like his cliff notes. And I don't remember anything from that book either, except for this one line where he's talking about, in the Christian tradition, this notion of grace. And he said, and that is grace, the movement from narrowness into spaciousness. So grace is this movement from narrowness into spaciousness. And if I had to sort of say, my great hope for any community of faith is that we might always move from narrowness into spaciousness. I would say that's my hope for any institution. That's my hope for the police. That's my hope for our elected officials, that we would be aware both of the narrowness where we currently are, but also the spaciousness of where the universe is calling us to be. And I just think that language, that imagery of sort of this constant movement, one, it frees us to simply engage in the work, right? Like, I don't know what it looks like to get to spaciousness, but I know it's maybe not exactly where I am now, but hopefully my life, my orientation, the way I engage with the world is a little bit more spacious than it was 5 years ago.
I love that. And I think it's a beautiful invitation. I want to think about with you where we are seeing, where we think about our local community that you and I both know pretty well and serve and love and care deeply about those local relationships and our neighbors. Would you say that, how are we doing on making space here? And what's the path we're on here as it relates to creating spaciousness?
Yeah. I certainly have thoughts, but, I have thoughts as someone who lives in a decent house with a 2-income family, and Fort Collins is amazing. I mean, we moved here on purpose because we heard it was a cool town, and 7 years ago we moved here for all the reasons that many of the people, I would imagine, listening to this conversation moved here. And the reality is, it is a good place to live for a lot of us, but it is not a just and generous and expansive place for all of us. We live in this world where too often it's, well, either things are perfect or things are terrible. And things are terrible in a lot of ways. Things have never been perfect. We've got to learn to be able to hold sometimes opposed things at once, right? So we can say we have a fairly robust system for taking care of homeless people. We do not generally have neighbors who are experiencing homelessness die on the street all that often. It does happen. It shouldn't happen at all. And it's not enough for us to say, we're doing okay, because these are human lives at stake. It's not enough for us to listen to public figures say, well, our police department's really good. Our police department might be okay, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't and couldn't and must be better. And so I love that we live in a community, though, where I can call the chief of police or I can call the mayor. The first place I served was Austin, Texas, which is, several million, at least the central Texas region is millions of people. And unless you have a special in, it's harder to affect change than it is in this town. I love that there are people who work with our neighbors experiencing homelessness who know the name of almost every homeless person in this. To me, that is both hopeful. I think it's a sign of we have people in this town who care, and it is a problem that can be solved. I oftentimes say that if we can't get it right here, no one can get it right. And that is both a hopeful statement for me to make and a little bit of a despairing statement for me to make, because I think we have faith leaders. I mean, like yourself and many of the people you work with at Foothills. There's a great group of engaged faith leaders in this town who want the very best and who are able to interact with those with kind of controlling the levers of power. We are a good-sized town with enough people and enough energy to make positive change in the world. We also can be very, very sure of ourselves in Fort Collins. And I think ultimately that is being sure of ourselves could lead to our demise.
Well, it doesn't make a lot of space confessing our failures. Like, then that does seem to me, when I think about it, about Fort Collins, that is not something that it's not very culturally present in our culture. And here what we do instead is we say we're learning. I think it's a very high, like there's a learning orientation in Fort Collins, and we're trying, we're learning, we're trying, and sometimes that trying doesn't ever get to an outcome. And there's not an accountability around the outcomes. I think Fort Collins we have a strong identity of being happy. It's a happy place to be. And that investment of being happy doesn't really make a lot of space for the pain and to incorporate pain into Fort Collins identity, which is just not. That's not how we identify. We identify as it's good here. It's happy here. There's nothing wrong with Fort Collins. Fort Collins is great. We're learning, we're trying to be better. And that investment in that identity, to me, is something we need to break down and be okay with having pain here. That part of what it means to be in Fort Collins is to be managing pain.
Yeah, and to acknowledge the grief that comes with that, right? Because to some degree, I don't think this is too strong of language, but that story is a lie. And I think there is some grief that will come with owning the lie that this is a perfect place. We can go one of two ways. We can move forward in hope that things could be different, or we can go down the path of despair and never come back. My hope is that we have a critical mass of leadership and citizens in this city that would be willing to move in the direction toward hope. But we can't do that if we don't acknowledge the lie and the grief that comes from our complicity in buying into it. And I think there's freedom that comes from, this is hard work, and it doesn't have to be despairing work. There will be moments of despair, but together we can move in ways that lead us into spaciousness.
We can stand in the swift moving waters.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what communities of faith at their best have to offer.